Hey friends! Today, we're diving into the world of one of my favorite actors, and a film where he shined in the lead role. Let's get started. I, Robot is one of those movies where fans eagerly awaited a sequel. The studio was all in, but Will Smith was Hollywood's top star at the time, drowning in a sea of scripts. The money offered for an I, Robot sequel was something he could get for any other film. Plus, Smith wasn't keen on repeating himself, especially since the first film was tough to shoot. The real reason the sequel never happened is likely because, despite being a box office hit, the first film wasn't successful enough for the studio to justify the insane paychecks Smith would demand. Unlike Sony's approach with Men in Black 3, where Smith also hesitated but the first two films raked in serious cash, I, Robot just didn't hit those numbers. So, they showered Smith with gold, and he walked away with over $100 million for that one film. Actually, Smith has a habit of dodging sequels. Similar situations happened with Hancock and I Am Legend. For the latter, a sequel seemed odd, but they tried to work around it with a prequel. Producers chased Will Smith with bags of money for years. The studio still hasn't given up on producing a sequel, as the $600 million box office success of the first film is too enticing to ignore. Today, let's revisit I, Robot, a film that doesn't seem particularly problematic and enjoyed considerable success. However, production was often chaotic. Initially, I, Robot was envisioned as a different film. The proposed budget was much smaller, not an indie film where everyone works for peanuts, but not a blockbuster either. It was meant to be a dark film, exploring the idea, how did we get to this point? With characters suffering and contemplating life. There was no mention of Isaac Asimov, whose influence is barely noticeable in the final film, and wasn't initially considered. The film was simply about a runaway robot questioning its existence. However, when the script was completed, Disney, the original studio, grew concerned about the excessive violence. Director Bryan Singer, attached to the project, couldn't convince the studio to continue funding, and the project was shelved. However, Fox Studios saw potential and picked it up. Fox agreed to lose the grim and violent elements, fearing it would hurt box office prospects. That's when Asimov's name was brought in. While the film is said to be based on Asimov's short stories, the creators insist it's more inspired by his work. Asimov was tied to the project because the studio already owned the rights to his books. With a larger budget in mind, the studio sought a star actor who could later be an awards contender. Denzel Washington was offered the lead but turned it down, finding the script childish and silly. He preferred The Manchurian Candidate, which ultimately flopped despite its $80 million budget. The role then went to Will Smith, who agreed to star in the silly film for $20 million plus 10% of the box office gross. Will Smith secured the same paycheck for his previous film, Men in Black 2. With percentages included, the studio asked Smith to temper his demands, and after brief negotiations, he agreed to $28 million for his role. The film's budget, initially planned to stay around $100 million, suddenly ballooned by nearly a third. While searching for actors and inflating the budget, the script underwent several drastic revisions. At one point, Jeff Vintar, known for his work on The Last Fantasy, was tasked with writing it. However, upon reviewing his work, the studio promptly fired him for producing what they deemed nonsense. In his place, Lawrence Connor and Mark Rosenthal, fresh off their Planet of the Apes script for Fox, were brought in. When they presented their draft, they too were immediately let go for delivering an even worse script. The studio then rehired Jeff Vintar, asking him to tone down his previous version. Fox studio head Tom Rothman also got involved, insisting his brilliant ideas be included. When Vintar finished, the studio decided the result was still subpar and couldn't be filmed. Screenwriter Gary Whitta, known for After Earth and Rogue One, saw Vintar's work and considered it the most brilliant script he had ever read. However, studio executives didn't share his enthusiasm. Akiva Goldsman was brought in to rewrite the script, keeping only Rothman's ideas. Although Goldsman essentially rewrote Vintar's script, Vintar managed to get his name in the credits through the Writers Guild, arguing that Goldsman's changes were made under direction and not entirely original. After the film's release, many involved in its production would say that if something on screen seemed nonsensical, it was definitely a brilliant idea from Tom Rothman that they were forced to include. In the end, the studio had a Frankenstein's monster of a film, with Will Smith coerced into starring for $28 million. Rumor has it, though, that he wasn't too bothered by the script wars. His only mantra to new writers was, "I must save humanity in every film I make." insisting they never forget it. Meanwhile, director Alex Proyas, witnessing the script chaos, tried to escape but was held back by contractual obligations. Once filming began, on-set conflicts escalated. Proyas insisted that Smith's character shouldn't be a wisecracking jokester, and although Smith agreed, the studio demanded the typical Will Smith charm. Proyas shot most of the jokes in a way that they could be easily cut in post-production if needed. Tom Rothman fueled the fire, deciding this was the studio's main film of the year, and thus required his constant attention to prevent any mishaps. Proyas, known for films like The Crow and Dark City, bore the brunt of it. Rothman visited the set daily, directing how to shoot scenes if he thought they were being done wrong. Proyas described making I, Robot as the worst experience of his career, likening it to running a marathon while the studio threw chairs at him and beat him with sticks. At one point, Proyas wanted to openly confront the Fox studio head, but was warned by friends that it could end his career in both Hollywood and Europe. The director claimed that despite everything, he managed to preserve the film's original ending. Rothman threatened that if the test audiences didn't like the ending, he'd personally reshoot and replace it with one he approved of. After working on I, Robot, director Alex Proyas vowed never to work on studio projects again, and he kept his word with his next film, Knowing. However, Gods of Egypt was largely a studio film. Due to his stubbornness, Proyas struggled for years to get his film about the war of heaven and hell off the ground. Eventually, he had to compromise, as Gods of Egypt had little chance of success with independent financing alone. Regarding Rothman, who comes off as a real-life supervillain, it's worth noting a few points in his biography to avoid painting him as a complete psychopath who seized power. He's been responsible for film production at Fox since 1996 and became the studio's head in 2000. He was instrumental in securing funding for James Cameron's Titanic, and films like X-Men and Ice Age owe much of their success to his efforts. He also backed Slumdog Millionaire, which won 8 Oscars despite initial funding struggles. While no one likes studio interference in a director's or writer's work, it's possible that Rothman, after major successes under his leadership, began to see himself as excessively talented. Or maybe, after facing criticism from industry professionals upon the film's release, Proyas, once hailed as a visionary after The Crow and Dark City, simply deflected blame, exaggerating the studio head's involvement. Unlike regular moviegoers, critics weren't fans of I, Robot. During filming, the studio faced legal threats from a real company named US Robotics. However, it turned out that Asimov's books featured the name long before the company existed, so the studio refused to change it. In a funny twist, I, Robot holds the 2003 record for the most product placements in a film. While it's unclear how much the studio made from this, it's said that Fox recouped half the film's budget before its release due to the sheer amount of advertising. I, Robot is one of the few big-budget films that didn't require reshoots or additional editing. The very first cut shown to test audiences ended up in theaters, with some claiming it had some of the best test screenings in Fox's history. The film hit U.S. theaters in July 2004, earning $52 million in its opening weekend and dethroning Spider-Man 2. However, the following week, The Bourne Supremacy was released, and I, Robot quickly lost steam. Many blame the studio's rush to release the film. Composer Marco Beltrami scored the entire film in just 17 days due to the tight schedule. The Bourne Supremacy grossed $176 million domestically on a $75 million budget, while I, Robot made $144 million on a $120 million budget. Internationally, I, Robot fared better, earning $203 million. Despite grossing $347 million worldwide on a $120 million budget, rumors suggest the studio was disappointed. For comparison, Will Smith's later films Hancock and I Am Legend each grossed around $600 million on $150 million budgets. The difference is noticeable, and while talk of a sequel persisted, the studio's dissatisfaction with the box office results likely prevented them from offering Smith even more money. Still, those numbers usually don't justify a $30 million paycheck for the lead actor. Producer John Davis hinted at financial hurdles, saying they tried to launch a sequel several times, but talks with Will Smith's Overbrook films always stalled. Meanwhile, Steven Spielberg loved I, Robot so much that he later discussed co-financing Robopocalypse with Tom Rothman, which could have served as an unofficial sequel. They sorted out the money issues and the project is still alive, but constant script problems keep delaying it. This started back in 2012, and the project resurfaced in 2018 when Spielberg said he was too old for it, handing it over to Michael Bay while staying on as a producer. But even Bay's grand promises of an epic blockbuster quickly fizzled out. Officially, the main issue is the pandemic, making it risky to shoot such an expensive film. But regardless, I, Robot remains popular with audiences, as seen in its high ratings on various platforms. Maybe it's for the best that a sequel never happened. Sequels are almost always worse than the originals. Thanks for tuning in. Stay connected.